The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment mandates that no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. At its core, this clause embodies a fundamental principle. Similarly situated people must be treated similarly by the government. This does not mean that the government cannot classify people or create distinctions. Indeed, nearly every law classifies individuals, for example, setting a minimum driving age or taxing certain goods differently. However, whenever the government draws a line, that classification must survive rigorous judicial scrutiny. The critical question then becomes, how closely will the court examine the government's justification for that distinction? The answer depends entirely on the nature of the classification being made or the fundamental right that might be infringed upon by that distinction. This requirement for varying degrees of judicial intensity sets the stage for the tiered system of review we will explore next. Now that we understand that the level of scrutiny varies, we must first establish the necessary prerequisites before we can even begin applying those tiers. Equal protection analysis under the 14th Amendment is not triggered by every instance of unequal treatment. The first crucial step is confirming the presence of state action. The 14th Amendment explicitly restrains state governments and their agents. It offers no direct remedy against discrimination perpetrated solely by private individuals or entities. If the discrimination is purely private, the Equal Protection Clause is inapplicable. Second, even when state action is present, the challenger must typically demonstrate more than just a disproportionate effect. We must look for discriminatory intent or purpose. A law that appears neutral on its face but results in a disparate impact on a certain group is usually only subject to the lowest level of review, rational basis, unless evidence shows the government enacted the law specifically because of, not just in spite of, its adverse effects on that group. These two elements, state action and discriminatory intent, are the gatekeepers to heightened scrutiny. Having confirmed state action and discriminatory purpose, we now transition to the core mechanism of equal protection review, the three-tiered framework of scrutiny. The judiciary does not apply a single standard to all classifications. Instead, the level of judicial intensity applied depends directly on what the government is classifying or which right it is affecting. Think of this framework as a hierarchy, often visualized as a pyramid or a staircase. The logic is simple. The more suspect the classification, such as race, or the more fundamental the right being infringed upon, the higher the level of scrutiny the government must satisfy to uphold its law. At the apex, we find strict scrutiny, reserved for the most serious governmental actions. Below that sits intermediate scrutiny, applied to quasi-suspect classifications. Finally, at the base, is the default standard, rational basis review, which applies to everything else. These three tiers dictate the entire subsequent analysis. We begin our detailed examination at the apex of the judicial pyramid, strict scrutiny. This is the most demanding standard, reserved for laws that target the most sensitive characteristics or infringe upon rights deemed essential to our constitutional structure. Strict scrutiny is triggered in two primary scenarios. First, when a law employs a suspect classification. These include classifications based on race, national origin, or, generally, alienage. Note that for state laws involving alienage, there is an important exception when the classification relates to participation in the political process or core governmental functions. The second trigger involves the infringement of a fundamental right. These are rights deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition, such as the right to vote, the right to interstate travel, or certain core privacy rights. When a law falls under strict scrutiny, the constitutional stakes are incredibly high. Consequently, the burden of justification shifts entirely away from the challenger and lands squarely upon the government to prove its action is constitutional. Now that the government bears the burden, we must detail the two rigorous requirements it must satisfy under strict scrutiny. First, the government must prove that the challenged classification is absolutely necessary to achieve a compelling governmental interest. This interest cannot merely be legitimate or important. It must be truly compelling, such as national security or remedying past, proven discrimination. Second, the means chosen by the government must be narrowly tailored to achieve that compelling interest. Narrow tailoring means the law must employ the least restrictive means available. If there is any alternative, less burdensome way to achieve the goal, the law fails this prong. Because these two hurdles, compelling interest and least restrictive means, are so incredibly high, laws subjected to strict scrutiny are almost invariably struck down by the courts. This standard leaves very little room for legislative discretion. Having seen the extremely high bar set by strict scrutiny, we now descend to the middle ground, intermediate scrutiny. This standard is applied when the government uses classifications that the courts deem quasi-suspect. The two primary categories falling under quasi-suspect status are classifications based on gender or sex, and classifications based on illegitimacy, meaning the status of being born out of wedlock. Intermediate scrutiny demands a more searching judicial examination than the highly deferential rational basis review. However, it remains significantly less demanding than strict scrutiny. While the government doesn't need a compelling interest, it must still provide a strong justification for treating people differently based on these quasi-suspect characteristics, placing it squarely between the two extremes. Now that we have identified when intermediate scrutiny applies, let us examine its two core requirements. The government bears the burden of proving two things. First, the classification must serve an important governmental interest. This is a significant step down from the compelling interest required under strict scrutiny. Second, the means chosen by the government must be substantially related to achieving that important interest. This substantial relationship is a more demanding fit than the rational relation required under the lowest tier, but it is less precise than strict scrutiny's requirement of being narrowly tailored. For gender classifications specifically, the Supreme Court has often stated that the government must provide an exceedingly persuasive justification for the differential treatment, a standard that sits uncomfortably close to strict scrutiny in practice, even if the formal test remains intermediate scrutiny. Having covered the heightened tiers, we now turn to the default standard, rational basis review. This is the lowest level of scrutiny and applies to virtually every classification the government makes that does not involve a suspect class or a fundamental right. Think of classifications based on age, wealth, disability, or most standard economic regulations. Under rational basis review, the burden of proof shifts entirely away from the government and onto the challenger. The challenger must prove two things negatively. First, that the law is not rationally related to any conceivable legitimate governmental purpose. Notice the key words here: conceivable and legitimate. The government does not need to prove its actual purpose was legitimate, only that some legitimate purpose could conceivably exist. Second, the means chosen must be rationally related to that purpose. Because the court only requires a minimal connection, this test is extremely deferential. In practice, laws reviewed under rational basis are almost always upheld. We have now fully explored the three tiers of equal protection review. To solidify your understanding for examination purposes, let us synthesize these standards into a single comparative framework. The key differences lie in what triggers the review, the level of governmental interest required, and how closely the means must relate to that interest. Strict scrutiny demands a compelling interest and narrow tailoring for suspect classes. Intermediate scrutiny requires an important interest and substantial relation for quasi-suspect classes like gender. Rational basis applies to all other classifications, demanding only a legitimate purpose and a rational relation. Remember this hierarchy. The classification dictates the scrutiny. Your absolute first step in any equal protection analysis is correctly identifying which of these three tiers applies based on the classification being challenged. Mastering that initial identification is the key to successfully navigating any equal protection essay question.